Good morning. I'm Bill Diehl, the president of the Greater Houston Port Bureau, and welcome you to our first ever virtual Commerce Club. I see many familiar faces out there on the sign-up list, and thank you for joining us on this new platform. For those of you new to the Commerce Club, we do this monthly on the second Thursday of every month, and we welcome you to join us. We usually have a government or industry leader speak about different topics that affect the port and our region. Today, we're very pleased to talk with Congresswoman Lizzie Fletcher as she sees things for key issues for the country in this region as she works in Washington, and particularly about COVID-19 and the infrastructure legislation that she is working on. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. This webinar is being recorded and we will make that available to our members afterwards. Second, everyone is joined in the listen-only mode. There is an option for you to ask questions at the bottom of your screen. Please do that as we go forward. And then if you see a question you like, please upvote it and we will prioritize those questions when we get to the question board. First, we're going to start out with the Congresswoman speaking, and then we will start questions. So I also want to recognize our sponsors for this webinar: Enterprise Product Partners, the Houston Pilots, Intercontinental Terminal, Kinder Morgan, Moran Shipping Agencies, Regions Bank, Targa Resources, and the West Gulf Maritime Association. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Congresswoman Lizzie Fletcher, who was elected in 2018 to represent Texas District 7, which is the west side of Harris County. Her bio is extensive and impressive, and you can find it online. But how I want to introduce her really is by giving you an overview of the important House committees and subcommittees she serves on, because I think it gathers and explains that she understands what's important to us here in Houston. The committees she serves on is the Science, Space, and Technology, and the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. For subcommittees, she chairs the Subcommittee on Energy, which oversees our national energy policy. She is the vice chair on the Subcommittee of Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management, which oversees FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. She serves on the Subcommittee for Railroads, Pipelines, and Hazardous Materials, and she serves on the Subcommittee for Water Resources and Environment, which oversees the Army Corps of Engineers. I'm now pleased to welcome Congressman Fletcher. The floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Bill, for that very gracious and generous introduction, and for having me here today. I understand this is the first virtual one of these monthly meetings, and so I'm really honored that you asked me to kick off this series as we are all adjusting to the new normal, at least for a little while. And so I really appreciate you bringing us together in this way at this time, because there is a lot of really exciting and important stuff that we are working on that I'm really pleased to share with the folks who are assembled today. But I also want to take a few moments before we delve into some of the committee work just to touch base on the topic that's at the top of all of our minds in our community and across the country, and that is the profound effect of the coronavirus here, especially in Houston and in Harris County in recent weeks in particular. I know we're all watching the news and watching the local elected officials report back on how we're doing here, what's happening in our hospitals. And I think our first priority has to be making sure that we are working to keep everybody safe and that we are working to keep our community healthy. And so that is my hope, that everyone on this call and that your families are safe and healthy. And my thoughts are, of course, with those who have been affected by the virus. Of course, it's affecting all of us in different ways, as evidenced by our gathering here today virtually. But it's affecting lives, it's affecting livelihoods, and I don't need to tell anyone who's here that this is an unprecedented challenge, and it's unlike anything we have ever faced before. And we've seen that in the ramifications that affect our economy. And so we are thinking about both protecting our health but also our long-term economic recovery and what the future looks like, and how members of Congress, how the Congress can help, how we can all help in various ways. And in Houston, we play such a vital role in the national and the global economy because of our energy industry here, because of the incredible medical community that we have here that's doing really cutting edge research. And of course, a huge part of our ability to connect to the world is all about our port. And so, from my vantage point, there's really no conversation that we can have about what our future looks like without talking about the incredible impacts that we can have coming from our community, and to think about how do we move forward, and what does the world look like as we move forward. And I think that I'm happy to and looking forward to answering questions kind of more specifically, but I thought I would focus most of my remarks, at least before the questions, on sort of the role of ports in that process, because I think ports, of course, are foundational to these questions. They're a connection to the world, right? And here we believe in and are very focused on the importance of trade. One of the other groups I serve in Congress, I'm in the New Democrat Coalition, which is kind of the centrist Democratic bloc. It's actually the largest ideological bloc within the House Democratic Caucus. That may surprise some, but there are more than 100 members of the New Dems, and there I co-chair the Trade Task Force. And so trade and the role of ports in that process and in that engagement, as critical, is sort of the foundational foreign affairs, right, is trade with other countries. And so thinking about the important role that our port here in Houston and that ports across the country will play as we re-engage with the world, and as we continue to rebuild our economy moving forward. So there's important work that we've been able to get done actually already in the coronavirus legislation related to that. And I want to just share a bit of that, but certainly the work that you all are doing, I think, is going to be really an essential part of keeping our community going right in this moment and in the long term. So a couple things about what we're doing at the committee level. As you mentioned, Bill, I serve on several subcommittees. I always love talking to groups like this because no one has to ask me why I picked or asked for the committee assignments I asked for. Transportation and infrastructure, of course, and serving on the Water Resources and Environment Subcommittee of Transportation and Infrastructure, where we're working on the Water Resources Development Act. And the committee's jurisdiction is so important because we do have jurisdiction over both the port project at the Port of Houston, and also the projects that the Army Corps is working on in Addicks and Barker reservoirs, which all of Barker Reservoir is in my district, and upstream portions of Addicks as well as downstream of Addicks are also in my district on the west side of Houston. And so critically important to work closely with and to prod along the Army Corps of Engineers and make sure we have a constructive, useful relationship and dialogue, and also that opportunity to ensure that those projects that are so important to our region are moving forward. So critical importance to our region. Right now, we're finalizing the Water Resources Development Act of 2020, or WRDA, as many of you know it to be called, and we're planning to mark that up next week. So July 15th, we're planning to mark up WRDA, and I've been working on several requests on behalf of our region in that bill. My top priorities for this particular WRDA, we're getting the widening of the Houston Ship Channel project expansion authorized, as well as, and I think very importantly, the inclusion of operations and maintenance funding for the locally preferred portion of the plan. And I think that that's critical. I am very optimistic, although we have not seen the final bill. I think the final bill is going to come out on Monday, is what I understand. And of course, that's always subject to change in Congress, but there's been a lot of conversations. I am on the phone daily and working very closely with the committee staff, and I am very, very optimistic that these projects will be authorized in WRDA. And so I'm excited to see that move forward. I think it's critically important, and I really appreciate the engagement really of so many people who I think are probably on this call today, and folks from across our community who really built what I think is a truly Houston kind of coalition, right? We saw a need, and worked on the process, as you know, through the Army Corps, but wound up feeling strongly that there was a locally preferred alternative, and we're able to work through the system to make that work and to build a coalition. Many of the sponsors you mentioned, I know, have been integral to that coalition to really get it done. I've worked pretty closely and had a lot of good opportunities to visit with folks from the port, including, of course, Rick Campo and others, to make sure that we are advancing those needs and convincing the rest of the Congress and my colleagues in Congress that this isn't just a benefit to our region, but how much the Port of Houston benefits the entire country, and that it is a project of national significance. And I feel very good that we have been able to accomplish that in the short time that I have been there. So that's critically important. Also on transportation and infrastructure, as you mentioned, I am on the Railroads, Pipelines, and Hazardous Materials Subcommittee, and that, of course, has critical role as well in addressing some of the LNG export facilities, especially working on trying to get closure on reauthorizing the Pipeline Safety Act, and just trying to make sure that we are keeping the engines of our economy here running and moving forward smoothly. And so my experience representing Houstonians before I got to Congress as a lawyer, especially working for a lot of midstream companies, has certainly helped in advancing that conversation as well. So that's some of the T&I work that's been a central focus. And I'm, like I said, I'm really optimistic about the port project, and know just what a boon it will be to our entire region, especially at this time where there's so much uncertainty about our economic future. To have this construction project move forward is really exciting. I also serve, as you mentioned, on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, and I chair the Energy Subcommittee. And I don't have to tell anyone on this call that our energy producers are facing an unprecedented challenge that's going to have long-term consequences for our energy independence, for our national security, and for our energy future. But there are some really important actions we can take to support energy producers at this time. Some of you may have seen, I introduced a bipartisan and bicameral bill with Senator Hoeven of North Dakota, who introduced it in the Senate. I was the lead sponsor in the House to fund a $3 billion purchase for the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The House Majority Leader, Steny Hoyer, has expressed his support for this plan. So I'm hopeful that we'll get it into future coronavirus related legislation. And I'm pretty optimistic about that too, although it's a little bit further out than the WRDA bill next week. But I do think that that's an important thing we can do. And in fact, I'm going to accompany Secretary Brulette later this week on a visit to take a look and to talk about some of these issues. So really excited about that. Also, I think another thing that's really important, and you all may have heard something about and relates to kind of the work on the pipelines, is that because of coronavirus, there's been a push to have a moratorium on the approval and construction of critical natural gas pipeline and LNG projects because of the pandemic, because of the limitations on public engagement and input. And so some of you may have seen that actually some members of Congress called for a moratorium on those projects. And I led a bunch of my colleagues in a letter to Chairman Chatterjee at the FERC, encouraging the agency to continue permitting and processing these important projects, because we know that we're going to need them, and we know what critical drivers they're going to be here and all along the Gulf Coast. So, they're critical to our ports, they're critical to our energy infrastructure, and they're going to be critical to our energy future, where we need to continue to lead the world. And exporting LNG is such an important way that we can achieve, I think, shared goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and also making sure that we maintain our energy dominance that has defined kind of the last decade, I think, in the United States. And so I was glad to lead the effort to make sure that we continue those processes, because I do think that that's critically important infrastructure that we need to be working on. And it ties in a little bit with what the House has just done in the last couple of weeks, which is pass a massive infrastructure bill. As we look ahead at just the staggering numbers across our economy of people who have lost their jobs, and unemployment rates across the country, and really some long-term uncertainty about what will come back and how, we know that we need investment in our infrastructure. We've been talking about it since the day I got to Congress, and our very first hearing was on the cost of doing nothing. So we've been talking about how we can invest in our infrastructure that we need to move commerce, to invest in our ports, to invest in our roads and bridges, to make sure that we can move things from the ports inland, to make sure that we're maintaining our inland waterways as well. There's just so many projects that we've been aware of. And so in this moment, I think passing this massive infrastructure bill that we just passed, which is HR 2, that there's really an opportunity to put our resources to rebuilding and doing it in ways that are forward-looking, but also will have just an immediate impact in terms of putting people back to work and getting things built. So I think that is something that's really important. And one of the things I mentioned early on that we were able to do even before that bill, but was to address some of the opportunities to do that for ports with the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. And I'm sure some of you have been tracking very closely the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund and some of the issues. I was a co-sponsor of the full utilization of the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund Act to make sure that the funds that are collected by the ports and are intended to maintain our ports are actually used for that purpose. For too long, this funding's been tied up and taken away, used for other projects. So I was glad to work with our chairman, Chairman DeFazio, on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee to pass this bill through our committee. And then it was included in the CARES Act, which we passed earlier this spring in Congress. And so that money will now be coming back to the ports to help with dredging and maintenance. And I think that there are real benefits that we'll see both from that bill that has already passed and been signed into law, and also some of the efforts in WRDA. I think that WRDA 2020 is going to be very, very good for the Port of Houston and for ports in general. So, so very excited about that. And I think that, one of the things that we have been very focused on is making sure that we are looking forward and doing things that are smart. And so I think the Port of Houston project that we've worked on is a really good example of the kind of partnership we need, the kind of partnership that I look to, and why I'm so glad to be visiting with you today. Because when we saw the first version of the port project, it was clear that that wasn't going to meet all of our needs. And by getting everybody together, building a consensus, we came up with this locally preferred plan that is now moving forward. And that's exactly what we need. And if there's one takeaway I have from my time in Congress, it's that, what I really need and what I hope you all will feel inspired and encouraged to do is to continue to engage with your members of Congress, because certainly for me, I take very seriously the responsibility to represent everyone across our district and really to think regionally and nationally about the kinds of impacts that we can have with the projects that we do. But I also know that the experts are the people who live and work in my district and in these areas. So to get the opportunity to visit with the assembled group here and the just incredible expertise and knowledge is really the kind of thing that makes my job not only something that I know is important to do, but a pleasure to do, to get to hear from you and hear the kinds of things that you would like me to focus on and prioritize and how we can partner. And I think, of all the messages of Houston, someone was just asking me this morning, I think that we do such a good job of partnering. And it really is an example for the rest of the country. And I think that the port project that we will hopefully see authorized very soon is a great example of our community coming together, working together, and doing everything in all the right ways to get a plan that works and that we need. And so I'm excited about that. I really do think that engagement matters. And so I encourage you to do it, certainly when it comes to the ports, but just in general as well, and appreciate that and very much look forward to hearing your questions, answering your questions, hearing your thoughts, things you think I should know, all very useful and very much appreciated. So thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, great, thank you. As we kind of line up to do the questions, I do want to champion your work on the WRDA. That is our priority one, the Project 11. Obviously, the getting it approved, and that opens a lot of doors for future discussions about how we're going to proceed with it. also the assumption of maintenance is very important to us. If we're going to push our money in to build this thing, we need to know that the government will support it going forward. There's one little thing in there, and I'm not sure if it's come up in your discussions, but part of it is having a little bit of seed money in there for the Army Corps to start their work. So we can't get them out of the box unless they're funded with a token amount of money, so that as we plan on our side to get the funding for it, that they're already engaged in moving forward. And I don't know if that's on your radar or not, but obviously the priority is to get it passed. Second priority is the assumption of maintenance, which is key to us. And then on a very small scale, is to give us some seed money to the Corps to get them, going, so that we keep the pace that we want with it. So
yeah, well, and certainly that has been, you're right, sort of the overall project, and then the maintenance has been the top priorities. But as you know, we've been able to get sort of incremental funding even before the construction, because the timeline is accelerated here. And that's really important to know too, because I think, again, it's kind of a model of how things can be done when you have a group working together so well and so effectively and advocating for needs. But these projects take a decade, right? And we're trying to do that basically in half that time. And so we've been able to get certain seed money and funding all along the way. And I do have to say, I've been so impressed with the relatively recent commander of the Galveston District, Colonel Diehl, who I think really understands these issues for the port as well. And so that has been incredibly useful to have a partner at the Army Corps who understands the sensitivity, and that we may need to do things a little bit differently, but we're going to make sure that they get done right. And so that has been, I think, a really good collaborative effort as well, to make sure that early funding is getting in for the Corps, so that we can keep the project moving and keep things going on time.
All right.
Double time, really.
You mentioned the Army Corps. I have a question concerning them.
Okay.
In that you oversee them. It's kind of our understanding of it is that, as because of the funding for flood mitigation and things like that, and other things going on here along the Gulf Coast, that a lot of the Corps' work, if you look at their portfolio nationwide, maybe 80% of it is in the Gulf Coast, not on the 10% on the East Coast, 10% on the West Coast. And so what we look at is, as that money came in for the reservoirs and things like that, and all the work that's got to go, their staffing doesn't seem to have changed as fast as, did they reallocate their staffing proportional to the workload. So how that plays out for our people is basically, you're a terminal. Every year you put in a permit to dredge in front of your dock, basically clear your driveway to get to the street, which is the ship channel, and you put that in annually to do it. Those approval processes are taking over a year. So it doesn't make sense. But I don't know if you could just take a note on that and take it back and ask them. It's like, hey, I'd like to see your work allocation towards the funding that they match up, because if Congress is going to give a lot of money to fix, storm surge and things like that, at the same time, we need to keep everything deep and wide, and they're got to be able to get into their driveways up to the docks. And if they can't get those permits renewed because they're working on flood mitigation, which we want them to work on, obviously, we just see it as they got to make some staffing allocations that match, so that their turnaround time is reasonable.
Well, yeah, thank you for that comment and question. I do think, dredging is certainly something I've been hearing about since the day I got there. And they really do so much here in the Galveston district. In fact, I shared recently, and if everyone hasn't seen it, it's worth watching the little video that they put together on YouTube of kind of the scope and breadth of what the Galveston district is responsible for. And certainly for my constituents on the west side of Houston, the projects to address flooding in Addicks and Barker are of utmost importance. And so, I would like to see them being able to do both of those things efficiently and effectively. And for those folks on here who do live in the district or are just interested in the flooding, they are moving forward as well. I just had a call with Colonel Diehl actually yesterday. They're moving forward on their proposed plan, kind of an interim plan on flooding and dealing with Buffalo Bio project specifically. But so I expect to see that rolled out fairly shortly as they continue that work. But making sure that the permitting process is moving forward is, of course, a top priority. Making sure the dredging work is getting done, making sure we have the equipment and the personnel to do the dredging is important. And of course, that's why I think it's so critically important that we were able to pass the legislation in the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund to make sure that those funds are being spent, because it's not only, I mean, some of it is the resources for approving the permits, of course, and some of it is just the resources for getting it done. And so I think having those funds dedicated to harbor maintenance will help with the dredging issues kind of across the board. But it's, your comment is well taken that we need to be able to do it all. And certainly if they need additional resources or staffing to be able to meet all of the needs here in the Gulf Coast and in the Galveston district, we need to make sure that they have them, and that we can do everything we can at the congressional level to make that happen.
All right, let me ask you a few questions that are coming in. So
Sure.
first one is, what do you think the timeline and path forward on the HEROES package is? And what do you think it will be for traditional energy projects?
Well, that is a great question. I think that's sort of, I would say it's a question of the day, except there were a bunch of Supreme Court decisions this morning, so everyone seems to be talking about those. But certainly there's a lot more talk about the HEROES Act. For those of you who haven't followed it that closely, this is a bill that's passed the House but not the Senate. That is an additional major stimulus project. It has all kinds of funding, including what I've heard both the president and several senators recently indicate support for, which is additional direct payments to Americans. There was the $1,200 payment out of the CARES Act that was paid out over the spring. This has a little bit of a different formula, but authorizes additional direct payments and is a little bit more inclusive of some of the folks who were left out the first time around, but also includes, importantly, funding for hospitals and first responders, and who we call our heroes, all of our healthcare workers. And so that's why it's named the HEROES Act. And in addition, there's a large tranche of the spending is for state and local governments. And that has been a little bit more of a political football, as I'm sure you all know, the question of whether and how much to allocate to the states. Our region stands to benefit tremendously from this bill, and it's the big cities and the counties. Houston and Harris County got direct allocations out of the CARES Act, but it's also the smaller cities. Harris County, I think, has 33 cities in it, and many of the smaller cities did not get CARES Act funding, including several in my district, from West University Place to Jersey Village. Those cities were too small to get direct funding from the federal government. And so there's a long story there, but the bottom line is there's a new formula here to indicate how much money should go and how it should be apportioned throughout the state. So in terms of whether or not that will get done, I think we're starting to hear the Senate, and we're hearing support for some of the concepts in the bill coming from the White House. And I am optimistic that there will be a package that moves forward, whether it's exactly the HEROES Act that the House sent over, or a response bill that comes from the Senate that contains some of the provisions, and then a negotiation, which is kind of standard operating procedure. We're about to do all of our appropriations bills, and these are appropriations bills as well. So the folks who work on them have a history of coming together with a House bill and a Senate bill and putting them together. That is what happened with the previous coronavirus legislation, with the CARES Act, the Family First Act. The first few originated in the House. The CARES Act originated in the Senate, but there's a lot of input from both sides. I do feel that, Senator McConnell said when we passed the HEROES Act that it was dead on arrival in the Senate, as unfortunately has been so much of our legislation out of the House this year, but, well, not just this year, this Congress. But I'm starting to hear more, especially from the administration, that I think is really a driver here. And so I'm optimistic that we will see that move, and there's some hope that we'll be able to see it by the end of July. So we're all kind of working towards that. Congress is in session. We're adjusting and working a little bit differently than we used to. So we're kind of spending 2 weeks doing committee work and other work remotely, and then 2 weeks back in Washington seems to be the new June and July schedule, at least. And so we'll be back at the end of this month, and I'm hopeful that we'll see something come back to the House at the end of July that we can agree on and move forward. And we do have, good allies, and I think a lot of people who are talking and in constant communication. And I think that's really important for us to continue to function and to show people across the country that we can work together. All of the bills we've passed so far have been bipartisan, and I think it's critically important that now we get that input and that we move forward another bipartisan piece of legislation.
Very good. Thank you for that. I know everything I read from you is the bipartisan and doing a good job with that. So thank you on that. I'm going to shift a little bit to talk about COVID a little bit, but just it's kind of two open questions really for you. One will be just general. What is the feeling in Congress? I mean, obviously it changes every day here as we're sort of seeing a resurgence here in Harris County. But what is the feeling up in Washington? And the second one, kind of tied to that, but a little bit more detail, would be, I know you oversee FEMA, and as FEMA, we see FEMA after a hurricane, you know, and we've been talking to the local Coast Guard about what does a hurricane response look like under COVID umbrella? And then, so the question is FEMA talking and kind of gearing themselves up for a response to a hurricane in COVID conditions? So
yeah, that's a great question. I'll try to take them in order because I think they flow nicely in order. Kind of what is the feeling in Washington? I think a few things, but this is really unlike anything that any of us have ever dealt with, this pandemic. Certainly the last comparable pandemic was more than 100 years ago, so more than most of our lifetimes. And coupled with all of the important issues that are going on in our country and the really critical things that we've been working on in terms of access to healthcare, we know that it is just, this is beyond anything that we have tackled. And so I think you see that play out in a lot of different ways. First of all, with those first three big bills that I mentioned, they were all bipartisan. They were put together fairly quickly, but they're really focused on looking ahead, looking to what the challenges are going to be. And I think what I see in our caucus meetings is a real concern about trying to be helpful and forward-looking. So you saw in the very first bills, we were authorizing funds to research a vaccine, trying to make sure that people have access to testing, but also having a big picture view of how do we manage this crisis for the long term, because I think that's what we're seeing. This is not just a short-term moment. This is going to be something that's going to cause us to adjust in lots of different ways. And so Congress has tried, I think, really to be helpful in anticipating needs in those very early bills, providing economic security with those economic impact payments, providing food security, which is critically important. I mean, I think probably everyone here watched the news and saw some of the real challenges that, you saw people dumping milk and other agricultural products because they had no market for them and no way to get them to market. And then you saw people who are hungry and the lines of cars waiting for food distributions across the country, but here in our community too. I was at NRG Stadium handing out food with HISD and the Houston Food Bank, and the need in our own community is really acute. And so trying to anticipate and provide so that we can make sure people have access to the things they need for their basic security. Very important: economic security, health security, and food security. So I think there's a real forward-looking approach that is both short-term and long-term. And you see the long-term piece of that in things like the infrastructure project and talking about what's going to happen to our economy. And I've had the privilege of listening. It's mostly telephone conference calls, but some Zoom calls as well. Microsoft Teams, all these new technologies are really getting used, but hearing from economists across the spectrum about sort of what the future looks like and what are the things that we can do to be helpful. And what you've seen is a tremendous amount of spending and an encouragement for more from some quite conservative economists. You see what's happening at the Fed. You see a real all hands on deck effort to mitigate the pain and the devastation of this moment and to plan for the future. And so I think that that is the overwhelming sense in Congress. And I hear it on a micro level on very specific issues like rent assistance, or people focusing on what industries are particularly hard hit, to a big sort of macro question of what do we do to ensure the health and safety of all Americans. FEMA plays a critical role in ensuring the health and safety of all Americans, and certainly both in my committee and in my own personal experience as a Houstonian, know what a critical role FEMA plays as it comes in after a disaster. And this disaster is unlike anything FEMA has ever dealt with. You know, here we have a group that's used to mobilizing and coming to an area like ours after Harvey, or going to California with the wildfires, going to Florida, and across the country when there is a disaster. Here we have a disaster in all 50 states and in the territories. And so it is beyond, in some ways, the scope of FEMA to handle all of it. That said, I think they have critical guidance to provide, and also a critical role to play. You know, one of the things they have been involved in testing here in Houston and Harris County, and that's something that as the cases go up here, we are very focused on making sure that they stay. And that has been a bipartisan effort from our congressional delegation, from our senators. But we also want to make sure that they're doing what we would expect them to do in an ordinary year, which is be prepared for hurricanes and floods and other kinds of storms. And so we've had several calls, both informal roundtable discussions with FEMA about their preparedness plan to ensure that they're prepared. Also on the Science Committee, in addition to chairing the Energy Sub, I sit on the Environment Committee, and we oversee the National Weather Service. So making sure that just the basic communications between the National Weather Service that's tracking hurricanes and tracking storms, what has COVID meant for them in terms of connecting with FEMA and being prepared. And the good news is they were asking those questions before we asked them the questions. So it's good that they haven't forgotten the work that they need to do. But I think for all of us, the real fear, and we all saw it a couple of weeks ago when, you know, there was a storm developing in the Gulf, having to deal with a tropical storm or a hurricane on top of this. And what we are seeing is changed plans. How do you shelter? How do you deal with evacuations in a time where we're supposed to be sheltering at home? And so they are developing plans for several of those things. And I feel confident that the agency, while stretched very thin, is addressing those issues and will be prepared should that happen. But I think we're all knocking on wood that despite the predictions, it will be a calm Atlantic hurricane season.
I think they just upped the number to 20 the other day. But the point, I'll leave the point, but I just, one comment on it is that when we would deal with responses, we would say it's all about communication. So when FEMA is going to come in, we need to know how they want to play the role and how they want us to react in that conversation of what their expectations are of the community has to get across to everyone so everyone can line up with the assistance they provide. So I'm going to go back to a couple questions here because they're coming in. Do you have any thoughts on this week's Dakota Access Pipeline decision?
Well, so full disclosure, I have not read the full decision yet. And I am a lawyer, so I'm always cautious to comment on the sort of the legal piece of the decision. But certainly on the practical piece of the decision, I have been on the phone with folks in the industry, and I think we saw kind of a mixed result because there's, of course, Dakota Access Pipeline, and then there's also Keystone or right in the news. And then, of course, what happened with the Atlantic Coast Pipeline with the decision just not to go forward because of the regulatory uncertainty. That's something I've been hearing about since I took office, and really before I took office as well, having represented a lot of midstream companies in my time as a lawyer. And so I do think that what I see when it comes to pipelines and more broadly when it comes to energy, it's not unlike what I was describing a minute ago in terms of the agricultural situation we saw or are seeing in COVID, right? We have these systems that we rely on, but there's a real fundamental basic education that people across the country really need, because we haven't had to ask those questions. So people are saying, why are we dumping milk when there are people who are hungry? It's because we have this very complex system and there's no way to get the products to other people. And we ask those questions with COVID. I think the same is true in my experience about energy. People are used to having reliable, affordable, and abundant energy, and being able to come home and flip on the light switch and the energy is there to power whatever they need. And there isn't as deep of an understanding of how we find that energy, how we move that energy, right, and how we refine it and how we use it. People tend to think of oil and gas as like gasoline that you put in your car, and they don't necessarily have that understanding. And I think it's certainly true in the pipeline space. I think most people, their experience or what they know about a pipeline is what they read on the front page of the paper, which can be an explosion or a leak. They don't know about this sort of hidden infrastructure because it's generally buried. They don't know that 99.9% of the time it is the safest and most reliable form of transportation. And so I think there's a lot of education to be done about that. And there's a lot of certainty that we need to make sure is part of the process, both for people who want to have community input, and certainly that is something that we value and we expect, and I think we need for these projects to move forward. But we also need to really, I think, have a good public education campaign on the importance of pipelines and the safety of pipelines, and we really need to work together collaboratively to make sure that these projects can move forward. I think they're critically important to achieving not only our economic goals, but a lot of our climate goals. I'm quick to point out to folks across the Congress, in my caucus and elsewhere, that natural gas has been really the key to reducing carbon emissions across the country and leading us to where we are today in the biggest reduction in carbon dioxide emissions and greenhouse gas emissions in 30 years. And that as you see the increase in production go up, you do not see the increase in emissions, and it's because of the role of natural gas. And so I think having a much more developed understanding of the ecosystem of our energy as it currently exists and as it may have sort of the energy mix into the future, I think that these projects are critical. It's why I encouraged Chairman Chatterjee to continue to do the permitting and continue moving a lot of these projects forward, and especially getting to the LNG export terminals, which has of course been a challenge that the regs are so far behind and that PHMSA is so far behind in this area, because it really is a critical piece of our path forward in the future. And so I do think that pipeline issues are a place where our national conversation can really be enhanced by the folks who are on this call, by people who are in the industry, people who know and understand the importance, the safety record. I always tell people in Congress that would probably be surprised, just about every meeting I go to in a company in my district starts with a safety moment. And both the health and safety record for workers and employees, as well as for the environment, are things that matter so much to all of the operators that I know work in my district and to responsible operators everywhere. And so I think that that conversation is one that I can really help advance, and also that we absolutely need to have so that we can make smart decisions about how we're going to move our energy in the future. And I think very much that when people understand and know the safety record and the importance of pipelines and what they are moving, that we can hopefully move that conversation forward in a very positive way.
We really appreciate that. I think you hit it on the head, that if people understand the business, they will get behind it. They just don't understand it. And that's, pipeline is supply chain, and that's what the Houston ship channel is to the area, as far as the jobs don't move, the trucks don't move, the connection for retail and all that stops if we can't get the traffic in and out. I think we promised you we'd have you off at 11:45. We know you're busy representing us up there. I just have a few closing comments and we'll let you go, but we really appreciate you taking time and appreciate your support of the industry down here and your understanding. I mean, taking the time to understand what we do is important, because I think you'll know why it's valuable to the nation. I'm going to close with that. I'm just going to, a few announcements. We will have our next virtual Commerce Club on Thursday, August the 13th. We will visit with Peter Fasulo. He is the co-founder of End Advantage. and has over 40 years of experience in the energy sector. He specializes in assessing the energy industry and advises Wall Street and the major energy companies on what he thinks is going to happen. He will talk to us about the effects of COVID-19 on the U.S. energy markets and its implication for our area and the Texas coastal ports. We appreciate everyone's time today. As mentioned earlier, we will make this recording available to our members. We will shoot you an email to tell you how you can get a copy of it. But thank you. Have a great day. And Congressman Fletcher, again, thank you for joining us. That concludes.
Thanks so much for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.